Joining me here, two old buddies of mine since we were kids, grew up together, Hugh and Scott Marcy, and their guest, Rob Bell. Rob, how you doing?
It's a fantastic occasion being here in Connaught, and first time I've been here, and it's been a great weekend, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the week. It's a good place.
I got a lot of questions here for you. How did you and Hugh hook up? Hugh got a hold of you, what, 2 weeks ago?
Yes.
Probably.
Well, Rob and I met in Southampton, England, and we were introduced by a common colleague friend by the name of Tom Bremer, who's a Norwegian.
Okay.
And this was 2007, Rob?
Something like that, yeah.
2007, 2008 time frame. And we started to do some business together. We traveled. Rob came over to the United States. We were in Salt Lake City, Texas, Washington, D.C. area. And I've been over to his hometown, Hull, geez, now probably 10 times, I guess, which is on the North Sea, the largest port in the UK.
Okay.
And we've been in touch ever since. And things were, the economy obviously in 2008 wasn't doing real well.
Right.
And the businesses that we were looking at were heavily affected. Well, the time's different now, and we're re-engaging on that. But as part of this, Rob started a group called the History Troupe in the north of England over a year ago now.
Yeah, about a year ago.
And it's been wildly successful. And so Rob put on a presentation Saturday, the 14th, at Arlene's Broadway in Buffalo, which is a fantastic venue. Very impressive.
Isn't that neat?
Yeah,
It's great. It really is.
And putting on a presentation this coming Saturday at 7:30, and we'd like to see a big turnout. It's,
Sure.
And Rob will talk about it. And so at any rate, we've become very good friends as well, families and so forth. So my wife and I have been over there. Rob's wife Allison is phenomenal, and as are his three daughters that are sort of just out of college, just in college, and getting ready to go to college. So everybody can commiserate with that.
Absolutely, yeah.
He has to say that after Valentine's Day.
Well, listen, babe, before we get to Rob here, I want to talk about you two guys. Now, Scotty and I go back, Huey and I go back, the Amboy days, all that sort of stuff. What have you guys been doing? I know you went to West Point.
Right.
And served in the military, and you went to Annapolis, right?
Right.
And served in the military. Are you both retired now?
We're no longer in the military, but
Right.
we're not retired.
No.
We're still quite hard at it. Essentially, as consultants.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I'd heard that. Yeah.
but yeah, Rob has some real issues with people.
Saying they're
they're
retired, they work harder than they did when they were.
That's the truth. Yeah. And Scotty, what are you doing now? You live in Alaska.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
With your wife Suzanne and son. You're consulting also out that way?
Yeah, a lot less so than Hugh.
Yeah.
I'm dragged back to work kicking and screaming. But I retired from the Naval Postgraduate School a year and a half ago.
Okay.
And so the last work that I did was in the area of defense cooperation, and we developed a program there to help the ministries of defense in a number of countries that had formerly followed a Soviet model or a Chinese model. We would help them reform their defense education and training. So I had the opportunity to work in Colombia, Cambodia, Mongolia, Bulgaria, Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, and Yemen. We didn't do a lot of work in Yemen, and whatever we did wasn't working, as you can see. But so about a year and a half ago, I retired from Naval Postgraduate School. But the project that Hugh and Rob are working on right now is very relevant for our area in the Great Lakes region. So it's
Good.
very easy to get motivated and excited by the work that we're doing.
Sure. Now, both of you were captains, right, in the service? I know Scott was, right?
Well, Navy captain, Army colonel. So.
Okay, a colonel.
I was a colonel when I left.
That's right. I'm sorry. Yeah. Boy, it's hard to believe all these years have passed. And it just seems like we're in high school. You know, it goes by quick, folks. So hang on to it. Which brings us to Rob. Now, I love your accent. It's the typical English accent. And when you first started speaking, that's the first thing I mentioned. How did you get involved with the presentations that you do?
I thought you were going to ask how I got the accent, but
Been practicing for 58 years.
yeah, easily. What happened was that my hometown is a large port of about 250,000, 260,000, and it was for many years. Am I looking straight at?
You're doing well. You're doing well.
It was a port, and it was also very well known for the number of people that came through Hull on their way to Liverpool and then on their way to the States. In fact, from about 1830 through to 1914, 3 million people came through, which is, they say, about 90 million Americans would trace their origins, as it were, right back through the port of Hull and then on into Scandinavia and the rest of it. And I've always been interested in the story, and so started to write some poems and short stories about some of those people that came to mind. And then also, about the same time, started to write stories about the First World War. And again, my hometown was, in those days, a port of two parts. On the west side, it was a huge fishing port. We had something like 270 trawlers leaving Hull on a regular basis. There are none any longer. And on the east side, it was a huge cargo port, and still is a huge cargo port. And what happened on the eve of the First World War back in 1914 was the cargo port was closed because of the Zeppelin raids that were blowing the place to pieces. First time ever that an army was using in serious volume a bombing raid to intimidate, I guess. So the port closed, and then the fishing was suspended. So in Hull, unlike elsewhere in the UK, there was no work, and on that basis, a huge percentage of the population, 70% of the menfolk, were working in the port at that time, and all of them volunteered to join the services, and off they go to the First World War. And I lived in a part of Hull where there was a street shrine, and as a 12-year-old I used to deliver newspapers and really didn't know what this shrine with a big list of names meant, and had a look at it. And in fact, I've got a present for you. This is Sharp Street. So it's a book that I wrote a few years ago.
Really?
And I don't know whether you can see this, but to camera, but what it has here is a photograph of a list of names. And so as a 12-year-old, I wrote a poem about this, and I found it a couple of years ago. And as you can see, a bit like the lists of honor that you see around here, it lists the men who went and it lists the men who fell. And in looking at this, I wrote a poem when I was 12, and I found it when I was getting ready for Christmas, and the poem was absolutely dreadful. It was appalling. I didn't value judge that, but 3 daughters of mine did. So I just decided I was going to rewrite it, and I started trying to get a perspective upon why the First World War still matters, because, you know, to many of my nephews and nieces, it's another war in another place, not really of any great relevance. And so one thing led to another, and I wrote the book, and didn't write it as a book. I wrote the poems, the stories about the guys who went to war, and not many came back. And so I started to figure out what that impact was for the families, and particularly the women, whose role in Britain changed enormously at this time, because before the war women didn't have the vote. After the war they did. Before the war they didn't really work in any occupations. And through the war they were in munitions factories and the rest of it. So it was a heck of a story, needed to be told. And so once the book was finished, we then sat down and I worked with some musicians, and we got a load of songs together. And the first night, 420 people turned up.
Really?
Yeah. And that was in a Methodist hall, not dissimilar to Arlene's in my hometown. And the mix of people who came, obviously my mother and the family, as this thing always happens, but what struck us was how many people, young people, came, because to talk about the First World War, or any war, in big terms, is interesting if you're a historian, but you need to really translate that into the impact on a local place, you know, like this place or my hometown. And people really related to the fact that some of their names were figuring in the story. Not surprisingly, because the schools they went to, the churches they attended were all still standing. And I think it then started to dawn on people that these people come alive, and the last poem is dedicated to my great uncle, who of course I didn't see because he was killed in one of the battles. And the opening line is, they say you die twice, once when you stop breathing, and this is the crucial line, the second time when they stop talking about you. And really that's what I was trying to get at, that you go to funerals, you see the photographs, and then you say to your daughter, look at this guy, and they say, I have no idea who you're talking about. And suddenly, having spent a few days with Chuck Marcy in his 90s, talking about the Second World War, it comes alive when you listen to a guy talking about a flight over Berlin where he's shot down. Well, I know that there was a battle, and I know there was a Second World War, but when you hear a guy and speak to a guy from that era, then it really comes alive.
Yeah.
And so, in the absence, now everybody, the last soldier of the First World War died in 2009, so it's now joined all of those battles, the Civil War, the whatever, that none of us ever could have ever seen and spoken about. And so that was Sharp Street, and the second one came up, and we called it Reaching for the Land of Green Ginger. And Reaching for the Land of Green Ginger is what we're going to be doing this coming Saturday. And that's the story of my hometown from 1830 to 1914. 3 million people came through. That's about 90 million people, as I said earlier, in the States can trace their origins back to that. And the coincidence was we were having a beer in Hull one night, and Hugh and I got talking about this, and 25% of Scandinavia, it's a staggering number, emigrated from 1830 to 1914. The Swedes had lots of famines, they had to go. The Danes had been invaded by the Germans and simply were not allowed to speak Danish, so they had to go. The Norwegians had real problems, lots of issues on work. They were the poorest, ironically, given that today they're by far the wealthiest with oil. But in those days they were the poorest Scandinavians. And then the Finns. Now, as I mentioned the Finns to Hugh, it became very clear that this place has a huge link with Finland.
Very big, yeah.
And once you start to think about that, then the story that I'm trying to tell is, who were these 3 million people who came through? Why did they have to leave where they were from? And how did they travel to my town? And then what happened after that? And in specifics, you get guys like Al Jolson came through Hull, and then went on to great fame as a musician. A man called Maximilian Faktorovits came through. His name is actually Max Factor.
Oh, yeah.
So you had people like Joe Hill, the Swedish activist who became a Woody Guthrie song, I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill Last Night. And you start to really think of 3 million is a number that doesn't mean much. But when you start to pick out the stories, and then you start to think of the Finns who came through to this place, many of whom would have come through Hull. And their stories, you know, they used to work with timber in Finland, they come to work with timber here. The style of the houses has similarities because the clapperboard is similar to those parts. And slowly you start to pick up a story. And we've written Reaching for the Land of Green Ginger. It's a curious title, and it's because in Hull there is a street called the Land of Green Ginger. And there are various reasons why it was called that, but I just thought that if you were back home in Finland and if you were back home in Norway and suddenly one of your cousins has made the break and he writes back to you and says, you know, really you should come out here, you should come to Connaught, you should come out to the Great Lakes, you should come to Hull, then Reaching for the Land of Green Ginger becomes a bit like Someday Over the Rainbow. It's the place where dreams are fulfilled. It's not just a street name anymore. And so what we've done is the stories trace where these people came from. One of the characters is Norwegian, one of the characters Finnish, one of the characters Irish, which is where my family comes from. And so suddenly you start to fasten on individuals to really understand the story, and you come across so many Finns.
Now, the show you did Saturday was Doughboys.
Yeah, it was really the story of the First World War, and really how the American entrance into the war impacted the whole story. Mm-hmm. We've all had coughs because it's a cold climate around here. Yeah, and Doughboys was the nickname given to the American troopers that came in, and the story of the American involvement in the First World War. If the Americans hadn't come in 1917, we would have lost the war. The Allies would not have won. Simple as that, because the sheer weight of numbers and funding of the American involvement in the First World War was crucial to the victory. Let's not forget that the Americans came in because of two main things. Wilson had actually entered the war saying, we'll never go in to the First World War. And then two things happened. The Lusitania, the passenger liner, was sunk in 1915 with 208 American lives lost. But then, remarkably, the Germans sat down with the Mexicans and promised that they would actually invade Florida, Arizona, and New Mexico and give it back to the Mexicans. And that was the Zimmerman telegram. And so that didn't go down too well in America at the time. And so it really was the catalyst for America entering the war.
Rob, wasn't there an assassination too of was it a president?
Yeah, the First World War started with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in a place called Sarajevo.
Yes.
And that happened in June, the summer of 1914.
Okay.
I was explaining on Saturday night that when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, about a month before, the Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany had actually visited the place of Kiel in Germany and was wearing a British naval admiral's uniform in order to start a race between the British and the German navies, but there were more schnapps drunk than weapons exchanged. And he actually stood there in the wardroom and said, "Friends now, friends forever." 6 weeks later, we were knocking hell out of each other. Mm-hmm. Such is warfare, really. About 6 weeks later, and it's amazing how it escalated. But it broke out, and 37 million people were either killed or wounded, and the dislocation of the European map was incredible. The Russian, as is known, the Russian monarchy collapsed, the empire collapsed, the German empire collapses, the Austro-Hungarian empire collapses, the Ottoman empire collapses, and somewhere in all of this, the Americans joined the fray. America did quite well out of the war, by the way. Well, the amount of munitions, the food and the rest of it that was needed by the war meant that the north of America, the big cities from Chicago, Detroit, right down to New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, were having a good war, if that could be said. And by the way, it had a huge impact upon your country because the blacks from, the Afro-Americans from the South, there was a cotton blight and there was no work, but there was a lot of work in the North, and so millions of Afro-Americans for the first time moved north and did particularly well. They were vital to the factories, and then they were part of the effort that left America and went to Europe in 1917-18 to do that.
Wow, interesting stuff. Now, your show this coming Saturday will be on the ginger.
Land of Green Ginger.
You wrote this.
Yeah, I wrote that, and as I say, that's all about migrants coming through my hometown. But the question is, why did they leave where they were born and brought up, and where did they go? And as we have discovered, a significant number of those were Scandinavians coming through Hull, and a huge number came to this place.
You do this as a one-man show. Do it all by yourself.
When we did the First World War one, yes, that was a one-man show. Back in Hull, we do it with a bunch of musicians.
Okay.
On Saturday, we're lucky because the two guys on my left are going to help me out.
Oh.
And we're also going to have...
Wait a minute. You mean Marcy's? The Marcy boys are...
Well, you see, they're
actors?
Migrants as well. But they don't know they're actors yet, but they will be. But we're also being joined by some musicians because really one of the other stories about migrants is I envision in our performance in Hull, it starts with a pile of suitcases, and in the suitcases you've got a lot of musical instruments. And so in the performance we did in Hull, you had a klezmer band, you had a violinist, you had a whole bunch of musicians, and they make stories and they tell stories to each other. And there is a song called Reaching for the Land of Green Ginger, which is all about a migrant really, and it's the story of one of the things that happens is when you leave your hometown and you are looking for the next hometown, in a way you can reinvent yourself. I mean, for example, a lot of these guys were leaving their languages. So the Finns that came to America had initially quite a lot of struggles because their language is a really complex language, very beautiful language. But how you adapt in these new places is a function of how good you speak the language.
Right.
And in the absence of that, you stick together. So you have your saunas if you're from Finland, and you have your churches that you all, in effect, replicate the homeland. You know, my grandmother, my nan, came from a place called Kilkenny in Ireland, and she came to the north of England in 1915 as a 15-year-old to work below stairs in a big mill owner's house. But those stories, they really need unpacking because people don't come from Norway or from Finland or from Germany. They come from a village, they come from a street, they come from a church, they come from a football team. I meant football team in my language, not in yours.
Right. I got to tell you that we have an art center here. It was called Kilpie Hall, and actually it started out as was that Temperance Hall or something, where the women didn't want their husbands to drink or something, and they turned it into an art center. It's very, very popular here, but it was all Finnish.
Well, the Finnish connection here is extraordinary.
It is. And, it really is.
And I've been lucky. I've worked in Finland quite a bit. It's a place I really like, and they're a very proud people, and they have a fantastic literature themselves. And so it would be lovely to see a lot of people turn up, because not only will I be speaking, but I'd like to explain the context for it. But then we'll be performing it. We'll be telling a lot of stories, a lot of songs, and really I hope a moment to pause and think about those photographs you've got at your houses now. And the question is, who were these guys and where did they come from and what was going through their mind as they settled and they built their houses and they put food on the table. And in many respects that's a hard ask to uproot your family, leave. Finnish guys, you're giving me a lot of time to talk here, but the Finns, remarkably in those days Finland didn't exist. And Finland was part of the Russian Empire. And remarkably, one of the reasons why a lot of Finns left, the conscription into the Tsar's army was 25 years for some of the ethnic groups that were not really serious to them. So the Jewish guys over by Poland and the Finns were being put into the army and expected to last 25 years in the army.
You know, you mentioned, I picked up on this earlier, you mentioned Jolson went through Hull. Now, how did that happen? I mean, Jolson was a Jewish gentleman, an entertainer, great entertainer back
Absolutely.
in his day.
Yeah.
And he actually went, I didn't realize he even traveled that overseas that much.
Well, the story is this, that we've talked a bit about the Scandinavians, but the other huge group were the Jews. And the Jews came from what they call the Pale of Settlement, so just out of Moscow, right across into what is now Poland, down to what is now the Ukraine. You had an enormous group of Jews. They were effectively, it was a settlement where they were living in small shetels was the name, shetl being the Yiddish for a village. And out of that area came a lot of people that now have family roots in the States, and one of them was Jolson. Now,
Really?
he left that area with his family, and there were various journeys that I've looked at that are really fascinating. For example, there was a grain train from the Ukraine right up into Scandinavia, into a place called Libau, which is present-day Latvia, actually. It's just out of Riga. And that grain train was a way you got out. So a lot of Jews traveled from the Ukraine and Odessa, which was a very big Jewish settlement, and then the Shetl, and then they moved over to Libau and left. And then the other group came out of Danzig, which is present-day Gdansk in Poland. They came on a really strange route, and that was the timber yards. The timber came from that area of Europe, and many of them would hitch a ride on the rafts, going all the way into the Vistula, the river, and then up to what is now Gdansk and away. And in both cases, they'd come through Hull. So you'd have, I mean, some days there would be up to 19,000 Swedes came through Hull in 1 week.
Really?
Yeah.
Hugh, you wanted to make
I
a
did.
mention.
Joel Sprecht, a teacher at Conneaut, is going to do 20 minutes of warm-up music, Appalachian, which is, of course, immigrant music, with two of his friends from Geneva. And so Joel has agreed to do this, and I'm very, very happy about that. And I'd also like to mention Clay and Melissa Nielsen that own Broadway in Buffalo. They've done a phenomenal job, for those of you that haven't been there, in converting the Free Methodist Church into a venue for plays,
Right.
musicals,
It's
etc.
wonderful.
And and thanks very much to them. So yeah, I just wanted to mention those folks. And
I got to tell you this, Hugh. Clay Nielsen, as a young reporter, or as a young student out of college, worked for me at the News Herald.
oh really?
Yes.
Oh, be darned.
And I hadn't seen him probably in 35, 40 years, you know, and then he popped up and did this. I'm really proud of him, and I watched him grow over the years. He's a great guy. He really is. He used to help me out big time in the day, so
That's
he's a
great.
Good
Well,
fellow.
you also mentioned Kilpie Hall.
Yes.
And Penny Harmony has.
Oh, great girl,
She's
yeah.
a great supporter of Arlene's.
Mhm.
And yeah, their stage is bigger. So Penny's been a great help in this whole thing as well.
Sure.
She's advertised it, and she gave me some heads up on musicians in the area. Funny that with this weather that people are leaving to go to Arizona, Florida and stuff. I don't get it. So a lot of talent is, the place is warm.
Migrating. Yeah.
It's the story all over again.
Penny is here every Thursday for me. She volunteers to come on the show and co-host with me, and we've become very, very good friends. And she has been building this this event up, so it's a great thing. That's a good thing. And Rob, so you are all set for this coming Saturday, then? Huh?
Yeah, to me, as I say, it's a great pleasure being in a place like this, because there's another reason, and that is this is very similar to the north of England in one respect. Economically, it's a Rust Belt area, and the north of England is too.
Yes.
So I'm enjoying this week for two reasons. One, because of the performances, but the second is we are actually looking at trying to develop trade links between the north of England and this part of the world, as in the Great Lakes.
Great.
And we're in the same boat. We need to rethink who we are. We need to redefine ourselves. And in many respects, it's a tough one, because instead of looking back, we have to look forward. So on that side of the equation, that side of my day job is all about imagining 2050 and figuring out how to get there in one piece. And that's a different story, really. But in many respects, it comes back to what we're talking of, and that is that when all those people came here, they were looking for two things: freedom and opportunity.
Sure.
And it's no different from the young of this area and the young of mine. You know, I have three daughters. We have three daughters, 22, 19, 16, and my question to myself sometimes is, are they going to stick around, or are they going to move away in search of freedom to be themselves and opportunity to
See, we have that a
stuff on
lot
the
here.
table?
We have
Yeah.
a lot of people that our kids have moved,
Yeah.
and it's kind of sad. Luckily, my son lives here, but works out of town, has to,
Yeah.
for the kind of business he's in.
Yeah.
But a lot of our kids have moved on. You
Yeah.
know?
Well, in many ways, I think it's the same as Hull. I mean, we had a fishing industry in Hull, which, as I said earlier, at one stage was the biggest fishing port in the world by some margin. And there were in the couple of hundred trawlers that were operating out of Hull. And then suddenly, in the 1970s, like a light switch going off, it was closed. This was closed because of the war we had with Iceland at the time. But it meant to the local people that the entire fishing community was without work in a matter of 6 months.
Wow.
And interestingly, fishing, as you will know from here, is one of the most dangerous occupations on the planet, still is. And in fact, where I live in the north of England is close to the mining community as well. And it was 17 times more people were killed at sea as were killed in the mines.
Is that right?
Yeah. It was a very, very dangerous occupation.
Wow.
Most of the Hull trawlers were deep sea, so they went right up towards Iceland. So they were dealing with this kind of weather all the time. Interestingly, Hugh referenced that we set up the History Troupe. I didn't want to write the poems and then just leave it at the Rob Bell Show. What I wanted to do was revisit my hometown and really give back to the local people a very fine history, and it's no different here. So when we do the performance on Saturday at Arlene's, and now that there'll be more people and not just my voice, it's an occasion to remember every single family here comes from someplace.
Right.
You know, and then you go back even further, and Connaught has a baseline which is really the Indian trails. So
Sure.
migration's been the lifeblood of this place for centuries, and in my case, and back home in Hull, going back and telling this huge historical narrative of the First World War, or history of Europe in this period, it means nothing to the school kids until you break it down and you can name a guy who flew over Berlin like Chuck Marcy, and the Second World War suddenly comes alive because you're in the cockpit, you've been shot at, and you're going to have to take that thing down and save the rest of the guys in it. I mean, some great stories from Chuck Marcy. I've really enjoyed that. But it's no different from what we're trying to do on Saturday. Now, one thing is listening to a few poems and a few stories, but when you listen to a few songs as well, then it makes sense. And it's images that matter. Before the break, I was going to tell you a story of a guy from Canada that I met 2 years ago. And George Allen Bogan is a magnificent poet. And George Allen Bogan came to Hull, and I was tipped off that this guy was coming. He rang the university and wanted to know somebody who could show him around. So they asked me to. And I picked him up, and he said to me, there's one reason for being here. And I said, well, you know, I'd be really interested to know why you've come. And he said that his mother, in the 1920s, had fled the Shettle again, the area, because there was no work, and she'd got a job in Montreal. She was on her way to Montreal, and she'd written a journal, and she'd written in the journal the one single image in the whole of the journal that really struck this poet, Ellen Bogan, and it was this, that she landed in Hull, and all she remembered was the smell of oranges. Now, that allowed me to pinpoint the exact spot she got off the boat, because the Hamburg boat and the boats that were going to Hull in those days landed at a particular spot, and that was literally across the street from the fruit market. Now, across the street from the fruit market, now you've got to imagine the smells of a port in those days, the smell of coal, the smell of steam, the smell of horse manure, because that was really what was around at the time in terms of how people moved around. There was a cough mixture factory just down the street, and we stood there and we tried to describe the smells that his mother would have had in landing. And then he said, in the drama of suddenly somebody just peels an orange, and the smell of oranges cuts right through the smell of sweaty clothes and the whole lot. And it was so powerful an image that it led me to write a song, a poem and a song that came from it. So what I'm saying is, put yourself in the position of your grandparents and the rest of it. Go back to where they came from. And if you don't know, try and figure that out. Right. Come along on Saturday and we'll help you. And then what you do is you try and get to the point of understanding what they're seeing, what they're hearing, what they're smelling, and by the way, what they're tasting, because some of these guys were traveling with food because they didn't trust the food they were going to go to. Now imagine that. You've got suitcases, you've got parcels, you've got the whole thing, you've got a musical instrument, you've got everything. You're scared that somebody's going to steal it. There are charlatans trying to sell you tickets for New York, and
right,
you name it. And then you have got the food that you're comfortable with is in those cases. And you don't like what you're smelling, the food that others are talking about, you don't like that. So I think the story is rich, and it's a story that is a story that all of us have inside of us.
Excellent, excellent stuff. Rob, I wish you well. I know you'll have a great turnout this coming Saturday night.
I hope so.
Especially with these two boys with you there. We got a little
Try it.
croup over there, Scott. You got a little coughing.
I was healthy till I got here.
I gotta ask you before I let you go, Rob. Rolling Stones or Beatles? What's your favorite group?
Well, Rolling Stones are from Liverpool, as you said earlier, and they're across the road. 2 hours from Hull. That's where all of these guys that we're going to talk about Saturday went to. So Liverpool I like because it's really a place which has such connection with Ireland. And it's a Northern England place, and they told great stories. I mean, their Penny Lane is about a street in Liverpool. Some of the things like Eleanor Rigby is the story really of sad people, and Help is a cry for help. Norwegian Wood is the journey that Britain went on. I'm a bias for the north of England, so the vote's with them and
With the Beatles.
with the Beatles firmly, but it's also because if you get off a boat and go to Hamburg, and I've been to Hamburg many times, and I remember the first time I got there, I get in a cab, and the cab driver spoke really good English, and he said, where are you from? I said, I'm from the north of England, because I'm proud of coming from the north of England. I went to university in the south, but I'm proud of being from the north. And he said, oh, you must have a look around Hamburg. We're famous. And I said, what, why? And he said, well, this is the home of the Beatles. Because actually, Hamburg and Liverpool have this constant battle as to where they really made their name.
Yeah, they played in Hamburg.
They played in Hamburg a lot, and in fact, John Lennon, who was my favourite Beatle because of his sardonic humour.
Funny man.
Yeah, amazing. And he once described his journey from Liverpool, and if any of you have been to Liverpool, or those of you who haven't, it's quite similar to the New York harbour, what they call the Four Graces. Beautiful buildings right on the waterfront. And then you go to Hamburg, which is like a step up in scale. And then, as in the case of John Lennon, he went to New York, and a great city again. But it was a progression. They're all port cities. They have a tremendous. I really like ports. I think ports are part of the solution.
We got a guy that works here. He's maniacally in love with the Rolling Stones. He wears their shirts and hats and all that stuff. And Bob absolutely loves the Rolling Stones. Has followed them for the last 40-some years, maybe 50 years.
I like them. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that in the 60s, from 63 to 65, the dominance of the British music scene here was enormous.
Amazing.
And it was really the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, many others. So I like both. I mean, I really do. And their longevity. I mean, they're the longest.
Isn't it unbelievable? All these years they've lasted.
Oh gosh, yeah. And you look at Mick Jagger, and he's just bouncing around like he was right at the very beginning.
In his 70s now.
That's right. Yeah, and then we have a guy who plays with us in the Sharp Street thing, and his father looks quite like Keith Richard, i.e., he looks as if he's been lived in.
Man.
Yeah. His face looks like it's been lived in. I like both of them, but I declare my heart on my sleeve on that one. I'm very, very fond of Britain and Ireland, but I left there to go to university away, and then I was away 25 years, 30 years away, all over the place, like Scott and like you.
Yeah.
But we come back to our homes.
Absolutely.
And we come back to, in a sense, tell the stories about our homes that we're all forgetting.
That's too much.
We are. I think a lot of us have got dementia before we even realize it. Our towns have got dementia, not just our old folks.
Yeah. I know you guys come back quite frequently.
Several times a year.
Yeah, really. I missed you last time. You were here this summer, I think, weren't you?
Yeah.
I was invited to a party you were having, and my wife was sick that week, and I couldn't make it. But I really wanted to.
Yeah, that's right. That was the biggie.
I just thought you were blowing us off.
No. My wife was actually very sick that week, and I couldn't make it. And I explained that to Shelley, but I was really happy that you got invited to that. Hopefully, we'll have another one this summer.
Yeah. I try to get back for the D-Day reenactment. Every year, because Dad's birthday is almost always at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I really enjoy the D-Day reenactment, and we usually host a party or two when I'm back. Shelley and I do. So
well, put me on the.
You'll be invited again.
Thanks, Scotty. Appreciate that. Thank you so much, Rob and Scott and
Thanks a
you
lot.
for coming in. This is great. It's a lot of fun. And Saturday night, 7:30, Arlene's Broadway on Buffalo Street. If you haven't been there, you got to check this place out. It's absolutely fantastic. And
Bring a guitar and bring a song if you want.
Yeah.
Sure,
As a matter of fact, you wanted to mention if you want to join in, you can do that, right? If you want to be a musician.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And perform.
Again, Joel and his mates are going to play the warm-up, but, my gosh, the song, my son is going to sing Reaching for the Land of Green Ginger. We'd also like somebody to do County Clare. What's
West Coast of Clare
West
is
Coast
an
of
Irish
Clare, yeah.
song which is done by Planxty in the 60s. But the other one is This Land Is Your Land, This Land Is My Land. That is another one that we would like somebody to sing. So yeah, I mean, come along, and it'll be a bit experimental perhaps, but what the hell, it tells a story.
Yeah,
and
have fun.
that's what it is.
That's what it's all about.
Thanks for inviting us on the
Thank
show.
you guys for coming
And
in.
thanks very much, Connor, for having me here, and I've really enjoyed it. And I'm
Enjoy your
sure
stay
enjoy
here,
some more.
Rob.